fine, thank you.
Good. Very good to see you, Chris.
Yes, same here.
And Chris, so we're talking about stories in our conversation today.
That's right, yes.
And I know that you're a great storyteller. Now, do you think that is a skill that, you developed naturally through stories that you were told, or is that a skill that you consciously developed? In what way do you think that stories are really influential on us, and why do you think it's an important skill?
Um, well, I've done some sort of remote thinking about this topic and the questions you posed to me. I hadn't sort of put myself forward as a great storyteller. I've always liked the form of the joke, which as a kid, I inherited from my elder brother, who still spends his life telling jokes. If you talk to him, it'd be just a series of jokes, and I have quite a collection over the years. And one of the advantages of collecting jokes is by the time you've reached my age, most of the jokes I know you wouldn't have heard because you're younger than I am, and so I'm a purveyor of old jokes. But I also, when I was a child, I was very keen on drawing, as a lot of little boys are. My drawing was fueled a lot by my mother, who went to art school, so she encouraged it, and her sisters also went to art school. So I had aunts who used to admire what I did, which was basically figure drawing, which would be around translating often the inspiration of cowboy films, football matches, boxing matches, all kinds of exciting activities that I was exposed to when I was growing up. So, um, uh, when I was age 14, around that time, I came into my possession the notebooks of Leonardo da Vinci, and I was really knocked out by what I found there, the craftsmanship and the sheer excitement of his drawing, the power of it, and it proved quite exhilarating emotion for me just to go through, leaf through, and discover all these drawings from the Renaissance. So even though I never took up drawing formally, I've had a lifelong interest in it. And this is leading on to something else, because I recently started to read a book just entitled Drawing by Philip Rawson. And it's reflections on the art of drawing. And he goes quite deep with it. I had this book knocking around for quite a long time, so I decided to sit down and read it. And in it, he starts to talk about what he calls the analogizing faculty of the human mind, of the human brain, which he says is at the root of all human thought, and that it's never turned off, it's always active. Now, he applies it to drawing in that you can take marks on paper to reproduce three-dimensional objects. That's one part of it. But you can also draw on other forms of memories and other areas where you can analogize. Sorry, it's a difficult word for me to pronounce. The what's in your head and put it down on paper with marks on the paper. Now, if you look at the wider view, I mean, this faculty of ours is at the root of language, which is probably our greatest discovery, in that we taken concepts and turned them into sounds, into words. And then we've taken the words and put them into visions, so that we've invented writing as well, and musical notation, and the whole mathematical notation. And all this is just down to the power of analogy. And what I'm aiming for now in this conversation in a roundabout way is that the story form is a form of analogy, and it impacts on our lives in lots of ways we don't realize, and colors our thoughts and guides our behavior. So for instance, if you take Mary Beard's book, SPQR, about the Roman Empire, she talks about the foundation myth of the Roman Empire. Are you familiar with the story of Romulus and Remus, Jesvia?
No, not very familiar, no.
So you come up from a different tradition, but it was one that was taught to me when I was in primary school, and it was told to the children in the class as though it were a true story. So what you have is these two twins that are raised by wolves. And then they decide to build a city, and they have two rival cities. And Romulus is building his city, and he's got to this stage where he's starting to build the walls, and his twin brother Remus comes along and starts mocking his efforts. So Romulus probably picks up a brick or something and kills his brother, and then goes on to build what becomes the city of Rome. And that's the story that's told as how Rome was founded. But as she points out, it also tends to reflect the whole history of Rome, which, if you look across the years, the Roman Empire was riven with conflict all the time, civil wars, and various factions trying to grab power. It was the story of Romulus and Remus more or less mirrored the whole history of Rome. But more to the point is the history, what the story of Romulus and Remus tells us is that Rome was founded in its beginnings on a crime of one person killing another person. And if you look at the foundation myths of any nation, most of them, including our own, is built on a crime. So it's usually one group of people coming into a country and taking over power, as the Normans' conquest came to this country and took over from the Anglo-Saxons, who in turn had taken over from the ancient Britons. But it was all done through violence and force. And yet, when you look at, say, our current royal family, they're a lovely family who we all look up to, and lots of people set their standards by the Queen and look up to her, and the press follow suit. But if you start to look back into history, it's all very murky. So that's a story that impacts on us. But in my own personal case, I mean, I was brought up, and I don't want to offend anybody, but I was brought up on the Christian myth, which is a story of a first century Palestinian preacher who, Jesus, who led his life, but his followers then built up a whole story around him, which has cosmic implications about the state of humankind, and how Jesus has liberated humankind and redeemed it from its poor state. So that is a story that affected my life from very early on. So what I'm saying is, at the moment, is that that stories abound and maybe influencing us, because we are pattern-seeking people, and we look for patterns and analogies which make sense of our experiences as we deal with each other and live our lives.
Chris, yes, you've mentioned two stories that when they shape our identity, they are fundamental in determining our behavior. And that's the story of creation, first of all.
Yes.
Where does it come from?
Yeah.
You know, so
Yep.
whether it's the story of Rome, or whether it's the story of Jesus Christ, whether it's the story of, you know, where do we come from? And where are we going? You know, are we going to heaven, or are we going to hell? Are we going to, you know, is this the only life? Is, you know, is our death going to be the like forever, or is it simply a reshaping transformation, and then is it cyclical? You know, so whatever stories, that those are the two fundamental stories, aren't they, of like, where do we come from, how were we created, and what's going to happen to us when we die, and the rest in between is basically the detail, isn't it?
Yeah. Yes, and a lot of the stories include supernatural agents who intervene in the world, and who are out there still to help us in our journey. If you look at the work of Joseph Campbell, who has looked at a lot of stories around heroes across diverse cultures, and his mapping out of the hero's journey. But Joseph Campbell has a story that resonates with me, because I'm no longer in a position where I want to rely on supernatural heroes, where he says, and this is an analogy that he uses that I find helpful. He said, life is like coming late for the theatre, or for the cinema for that case, where you push into the row, causing quite a bit of disturbance, which we do when we arrive. There's no good time to be born. Whenever you're born, it causes a lot of inconvenience to people. Then you sit down, and then you turn to someone next to you and get them to explain what the plot is of the play or the cinema that you which again is like we arrive in the world, and then we are fed a version of what the plot is by our elders in the education system, and then we get involved in the plot, in the film, in the play, and we get absorbed into it. And then at some point, someone taps you on the shoulder and says, "Hey, Chris, it's time to go." Now, that could be a good. I mean, the best thing is if you actually are absorbed in the plot, but you always want to know what happens next. And so, you know, I always want to know what happens next with the family. But at some point, I'm not going to know what happens next. And I think the worst point is when someone taps you on the shoulder and says, "It's time to go," and you say, "Oh, thank goodness for that." You know, I'm bored to tears.
Yeah.
So,
And I suppose life can be a metaphor like that. You know, you've given us a metaphor of life presented by Joseph Campbell, that life is like a theatre, life is like a film that we create, we construct. And you know, I think it was Shakespeare that said all the world is a stage, right?
yes, that's right.
The world is a stage. And so it's, some of us choose the roles that we play. We have the privilege to be either given those roles of the main protagonist, or we claim them for ourselves, and others simply play the extras who are overlooked, overshadowed. They just seem to be on the fringes of what's actually happening. And do you think that if we are more conscious of the story, do you think that we perhaps have more choices about changing our roles and determining how how we may give feedback to the director of the film or the theatre and whatever, of the play. We might be in a position to say, I'd like to change my role in this way.
Yeah, are you familiar with the work? I only came across it a couple of weeks ago, so of a man called Marshall Gantz.
No, I'm not. No.
Okay, no, I sit in a group that they call themselves the Rebel Alliance, and it's really some hotshot managers in the health service who want to change things about, and they were talking about Marshall Gantz. So I looked him up, and he talks about the three narratives that are at the center of our lives, that if which we should make conscious, that if you are trying to achieve, the first narrative is a narrative of self. That is, what are you trying to achieve? What are your goals? What are your ambitions? How are you going to achieve it? And that involves listeners who get drawn into your aims and objectives. The second narrative is the narrative of us. That is the group you belong to, who they are, and again, what their aims and objectives are, and how they present themselves to the world. And the third narrative is the narrative, what he calls the narrative of now, which is faced with the future and faced with the present. What are our next steps? How are we going to shape the future? So it's really, as you were saying, it's being conscious of your story and the role you play, and not just life, letting life happen to you, but have some public goals, some aims to affect public behavior and public policy, and of course, the battle plan is not the battle, but it helps if you have a plan and know what particular narrative you're working in at the time.
And I suppose we need to have this philosophy, whether, regardless of whether we're conscious of this philosophy or not conscious of it, there is a philosophy that guides our behavior. Like, what is our philosophy of life? Deterministic? Are we fatalistic? Are we waiting for the signs to guide us into, like the next step, or are we being more conscious and making conscious decisions? And like you talked earlier about the supernatural, are there supernatural forces, that invisible hand that is guiding us into like where we need to be, who we need to be with? Or are we simply, is that simply an illusion? Is it or a matter of making conscious choices, or is it intuitive? Are we allowing choices to be made on our behalf? That's part of our philosophy, isn't it? It's like,
yes. And as you were talking about the creation myth, it depends on how proactive your philosophy is, or are you just a passive recipient of a plaything of the gods, or what? There's all kinds of different scenarios or different analogies that we can draw from the world around us. So it's amazing how often the heroes and the gods all have these human attributes, and that we create for ourselves and for the mythical world that we think is out there. So reflecting our own characteristics and observations.
And I know we've had many conversations about the subject of creativity, in terms of, is creativity something that we allow to express itself through us, or is creativity something that can be consciously taught? My position on this. I believe that creativity is, it's not simply to do with thinking. It's a whole lot more. Thinking is only one small part of it. and there's a whole story, like what is our story about creativity, and how does that story about creativity fit in with the bigger picture, as it were? What are your thoughts on that, Chris?
Well, funnily enough, I was watching a TED talk last week, I think it was, by someone called Rossman, Martin L. Rossman, who is an academic in the States, but he's a psychologist, and he was looking at human emotions, and I mean, his the tenor of his talk was how we can control our anxiety, our worry, and our stress. The three different aspects of our emotions that come from different parts of our anatomy. So when he was talking about worry, he's saying worry can be adaptive or maladaptive. So if you worry, if you can isolate the problem and find a solution to it, then worry has an adaptive phase to it. If you just keep returning and returning to the same problem and turning it over and turning it over, it's maladaptive, and it has bad consequences. So he was saying that looking at the human brain and the neocortex, as you know, traditionally we do it in the right side and the left side of the brain. He said a lot of our thinking is on the right side of the brain, and it's verbal and it's logical. The left side of the brain is where the imagination lies. And he says that perhaps most human progress comes out of the imagination from visualization. And he was saying how to use visualization techniques to boost your confidence and to put yourself into areas where you are successful, rather than verbalizing bad scenarios. So he was using it as a technique to overcome worry, anxiety, and stress. But it's this area of the imagination which he says is not taught in schools, because we stress all the time the logical, the verbal. You've been over this ground before, but it's that silent side of human nature where probably the solution to our problems lies, and it's our visualizing a future and breaking that and looking at the positives that we can achieve, looking at a world which we have to visualize, a world where there's carbon reduction and the sort of lives we can lead. And that is often just a visual thing rather than just working it out logically.
I remember being at secondary school and my teachers often telling me to stop daydreaming.
Daydreaming?
Yeah, I used to kind of go off into a world of my own, and it was clear
Yeah.
I wasn't paying any attention, and they'd snap me out of it and say, stop daydreaming.
Yeah.
Not only myself, like lots of other students as well, who were similarly bored, I suppose, and creating their own realities in their own heads. And I think looking back, they shouldn't have been telling me to stop daydreaming. They should have been asking me what I was daydreaming about.
Yeah. Yes.
Much better, much more effective way, because they could have guided me to make those daydreams more productive, perhaps. I don't think I was always daydreaming in a very productive way. Lots of times I was in a world of my own, thinking about gloom and doom. So I suppose like worrying, like worrying about things, worrying about scenarios, and it would have shifted my perception, because I think I've formed a habit of going off on tangents and thinking about all the disasters and things that we've got to save the world from. And that is not always constructive. And I think there's a much better, more effective way of using our imagination to be creative and to imagine the futures that we do want.
Yeah, yes, that's right. And because I mean, all this legacy that we have has come from years and years of evolution. So he talks about the triune brain. So the neocortex, that's the thinking part, but that's also where worry comes from. Then there's the midbrain, that's where anxiety comes from, the limbic emotional system that we have, and then the reptilian brain, and the brain stem, which is where the stress comes from, which is a very physical thing. So it's good, I suppose, in a way. He's verbally divided the human being into three parts in a simplistic way, but it's trying to locate where the mainspring of our hope and our imagination and our ability to move forward in a positive way comes from.
Well, you talked earlier about drawing, about how at an early age you learned to draw, and I think drawings tell a story in themselves.
Yeah.
And even before people started to communicate using verbal language, they communicated through making signs and leaving signs for each other. And the symbology, it's a whole language in itself, isn't it?
Yes, right.
Symbolic language. And a cross, what does the cross mean? What does the swastika mean? What does the we have all these Celtic symbols. The jewelry consisted of various symbols, and what did those symbols represent? In what way were they powerful in shaping the values of those who wore that jewelry, for example, wore that symbology. So with symbols, and because that cuts across cultures and it cuts across languages as well, doesn't it? That if we don't speak someone else's language, we can make signs and communicate and tell a story that way, can't we?
Yeah. Oh yes, it's. I think if you talk to anybody who's involved in dance or mime, they will say that's the primal communication, that we did that before we started to speak to convey our meaning, and then often we invented words to fill in the gaps between our signage, physical signage, so that we conveyed our full meaning.
And I suppose our emotions tell a story too, that when we shed tears, regardless of whether the other person can understand our language, they know what, they have some impression of what the story that your tears tell.
Or laughter.
Laughter, that's
yeah.
right. Yeah. So
that's universal, yeah.
They're universal stories, aren't they? The stories told by those gestures, I suppose. Gestures especially. And in terms of the mystery around stories and creativity, we hear a story and we can interpret it, but there's always something that is mysterious in how those stories interconnect with each other, isn't there?
Yes, it's this what Rawson is talking about, this analogy and this faculty, which is, he says, it's on all the time. We're doing it all the time, creating these likenesses and mapping across from our experiences. So, I mean, there's the novelist, which E.M. Foster, he has this phrase, only connect. Mm-hmm. And it's these connections we make as humans that lead to innovation, that we're bringing two things together. And humor is often at the humorist often sees the difference in the sameness, and the sameness in the difference, which people don't normally notice. But the person who's able to make us laugh is someone who pulls the rug out from under our assumptions.
Wasn't it Steve Jobs that also said only connect? Did he not say something similar to that about recognizing patterns through
He
making?
may have done, yes.
But again, it's like, yeah, that's again, stories enable us to make connections. We tell a story and we can see the similarities and the differences between another story, and we can see how those stories link together. And as you say, the story is a metaphor, it's an analogy, it's not the reality, it's our interpretation of it, isn't
That's
it?
right. It puts a pattern on the phenomena, yeah,
Yeah,
that we can relate to.
in what way do you think stories can empower us then?
Well, I mean, if you've, I mean, like for instance, that story I told from Joseph Campbell, it helps me deal with the fact that, you know, that death is an inevitability. There's some points in your life where you think you're immortal. And as someone once said, I know everyone's got to die, but I thought there'd be an exception in my case. So it's kind of, it just helps me with that particular aspect of coming to the end. And sometimes people do come to me and say, I've only got a few months to live. You know, you can start talking to them in a way that's comforting and helpful, you know.
Yeah.
So that's one way of being empowered. But I think there are a lot of examples of people who you know, especially stories of the underdog, you know, who've fought back against the odds and you know, that keep people hoping and striving.
Because the underdog is, that story is primal, isn't it, in terms of like being able to overcome the villain. You know, in every good story there is the hero and the villain, and so the underdog is the you know, is that character, is that protagonist who is successful in slaying the dragon, as it were. And the dragon can be simply challenges, you know, of poverty, or the dragon can be that ruthless other, you know. But without some sort of villain, the story doesn't stack up, does it? You know, there
No,
needs,
that's right. Yes, you need the nemesis character, as they say when you're writing a screenplay. That you've only got the hero, then you've got to have probably his sidekick, so that they can exchange thoughts and attitudes, and then you've got the nemesis character who he has to overcome, who's his antagonist.
and sometimes that antagonist can be ourselves. It can be our own inner demons that you know are saying you don't deserve to be the leader of the pack. You know, you just don't deserve it. And so we hold ourselves back. And so those the villain, sometimes the villain is internal, and sometimes the villain is external. Sometimes it's a person, sometimes it's things, you know, the location. You know, maybe we live in a place where there's been a drought for years, and so the villain is the climate.
Yeah, or it just could be somebody. It could be a parent. It could be a partner. You know, it could be somebody saying, "You're no good. You're not up to this," and you know, just belittling their efforts. So that there's all sorts of all sorts of ways of making it different. Yeah.
I suppose one of the choices that we can make then is like choosing what kind of story do we want to hang on to, what kind of story do we want to co-create, what kind of story is useful to us, because you know the story that is meaningful to you may not be so relevant and useful to me, because we have different values, we have different personal histories. And so the story that is going to be most interesting and valuable to us is going to be that story where we have a meaningful role rather than simply being an extra in it.
Yeah, and I think that's what Marshall Gantz is saying. You know, that there's our own particular slant on life and what we're trying to do, but then you've got to widen that out into the us and to the group, and to draw people in all the time. So as you're saying, that it's good if you can have some conscious choice to recognize the value of story, and because that's and then to use it to inspire yourself and to inspire others. Yeah,
absolutely. Okay, excellent. Well, thank you very much, Chris. I've really enjoyed my conversation with you, and I will speak with you on Saturday.
Yes, on Saturday.
Okay, brilliant.
All right, thanks, Jesby.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.